Banjo and Kazooie are a beloved and inseparable duo, and together they form an irreversible landmark of video game culture. People often look back on them fondly, but when they do, it's often limited to the first game of their series, Banjo Kazooie. And honestly, that's not surprising. I recently released a retrospective on that game, and I covered a lot of the things that give it such a lasting appeal, as well as some of its flaws. But at the end of that video, I made a pretty bold statement. Banjo Kazooie is great, but its sequel, Banjo Tooie, is better. I say that's a bold statement only because it's a fairly unpopular opinion. Most people I hear talk about these games consider Tooie to be vastly inferior, some going as far as to call it a bad game outright. Now, before we get into this at all, I want to say that if you prefer Kazooie, if you think it's the better game, that's a completely valid opinion. You are free to like whatever you want for whatever reason. When I give my opinions in these videos, I'm not stating them as undeniable fact. I'm just telling you how I feel about subjects I care about, just sharing how I see things. And when it comes to Banjo Tooie, my opinion is that it's criminally underappreciated. I'm going to be spending the rest of this video discussing everything I love about this game, and I urge you to stick around and hear me out. Nothing I say here is an attack on anyone's point of view, and I really hope that goes without saying. Please consider liking and subscribing. It means more than you can possibly know. With all that said, let's dive in and talk about what makes Banjo Tooie such a fantastic sequel. The first thing you'll notice upon starting Banjo Tooie is that it's lost some of that bombastic, in-your-face energy its predecessor had. It's much less over the top, and whether this is a good or a bad thing is a matter of preference. I personally like the more subdued vibe of Tooie, which overall is quite a bit darker than the bright, cartoony Kazooie, both in tone and subject matter. This allows the game to establish some really nice atmospheres, from the lush jungle of Mayahem Temple, to the haunting whimsy of Witchy World, to the beautiful placidity of Jolly Roger Lagoon's Atlantis. Banjo Tooie's worlds are masterfully crafted to make them both delightfully inviting and incredibly engaging to explore. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The opening cutscene begins on a dark, stormy night, establishing the game's darker tone. We're told that Grunty has remained buried under the boulder we dropped on her in the last game for 2 years, as her loyal stooge Klungo tries to free her, with little success. Suddenly, a machine of some kind drills through the canyon wall, out of which 2 witches emerge. This is Mingella and Blobelda, Gruntilda's sisters, and they are here to free her at last. In the meantime, Bottles and Mumbo have joined Banjo and Kazooie in their home for a game of cards, one that Mumbo appears to be winning handily. Hearing the commotion, Kazooie deftly manipulates Mumbo into checking it out, allowing her to steal his winnings. Classic Kazooie. Mumbo arrives on the scene just in time to see the sisters use their magic to blast the boulder keeping Grunty down, allowing the villainous witch to rise from her grave at last. Grunty is a much more imposing and threatening villain in this game, and that includes her appearance. Her clothes are tattered and torn, and her body has rotted away, leaving her as just a skeleton. As cool as this is, Grunty herself isn't pleased with the change, and is intent on getting her old body back. Man, I feel like a lot of trouble could have been avoided if someone just told Grunty she was beautiful just the way she is. A little body positivity goes a long way, you know. But I digress. Grunty spots Mumbo and chases him down, hurling spells at him as he hurries to warn the others. They all flee as Grunty prepares to blast Banjo's house, escaping just in time. Well, everyone except Bottles. After seeing what Kazooie pulled, he isn't leaving his poker winnings unguarded. Consequently, he sits there like an idiot while Grunty casts her spell, convinced it's just another trick. Satisfied with her work, Grunty and her sisters leave, but not before releasing a horde of monsters to wreck Spiral Mountain. Banjo, Kazooie, and Mumbo congregate outside their poor house, commiserating over the state of their home, before finally realizing that Bottles is missing. Right on cue, he hobbles out of the charred house, falls over, and dies. So yeah, this game starts with Bottles getting murdered, setting Banjo and friends on a quest for revenge. This is a huge step up from the story of Banjo Kazooie, which was just about saving Banjo's sister. Speaking of Tootie, I haven't seen her. I wonder where she could... Oh god. Dingpot, what did you do? I knew you couldn't be trusted. Well, Tootie's probably dead, but more importantly, so is Bottles. The game starts properly in Spiral Mountain, which has been absolutely devastated. This is a sharp contrast to what this area was in the original game. The once happy, bubbly song is now morose and haunting. Banjo's house has been decimated, the bridges have been destroyed, the canyon walls are crumbling, and even Grunty's lair is looking rough. But Grunty's lair isn't where you'll be spending your time in this game, as the interior is in even worse shape and the way forward is blocked. We have to pursue Grunty through the giant hole she left in the side of Spiral Mountain, where Klungo is waiting for us. Klungo was in Banjo Kazooie, but his inclusion was so minimal that you might have missed him. He plays a much more prominent role here, as the first of Banjo Tooie's mini boss fights. Banjo Kazooie only really had the one boss fight against Grunty, with a few enemy encounters coming close. Boss fights feature quite prominently in Banjo Tooie, and there's at least one in each world. I like these a lot. Banjo and Kazooie's moveset lends itself well to boss battles, and more importantly, they inject some spectacle into the experience, giving each world a nice little centerpiece. The bosses have incredible musical themes and a lot of personality as well, and I'll talk a little bit about each of them as we go. Some are better than others, but overall I think bosses are a great addition to Banjo's formula. Klungo is laughably easy, and after he loses, he runs off, urging Grunty to give him a beating as punishment. And who can blame him? I wouldn't mind a beating from Grunty myself. Anyway, his defeat means we're free to move on to Jinjo Village. This is home, obviously, to the Jinjos who, if you'll remember, were instrumental in defeating Grunty the first time. I have always loved Jinjo Village. When I was a kid, I would just hang out here, listening to the music, checking out the adorable color-coded houses, paying my respects to the dead Grey Jinjos, and admiring King Jingling's palace. King Jingling tells us that Grunty's drill machine scared all the Jinjos away from their homes, minus the gray ones that were flattened. Like any politician, he doesn't actually seem too worried about the well-being of his people, and only wants them returned so they can compete in a kickball tournament. Naturally, he asks Banjo and Kazooie to do this for him, and he gives them their first Jiggy as an incentive. They leave, commenting on how cool he was. I mean, I didn't think he was that cool, and Grunty agrees. She's pissed that he would dare help her mortal foes, and she actually calls him a traitor, which implies he was formerly loyal to the witch. Never noticed that before. Fortunately for Grunty, her sisters have created a machine that will not only allow her to get revenge, but also get her body back. This is the Big Ol' Blaster, or Bob, and it has the ability to suck the life force from other beings and blow it into someone else. Hey, don't look at me, that's just what it says on the buttons. Jingling becomes the first victim of Bob, leaving him in a zombified state. His life force isn't quite enough to reconstitute Grunty's bountiful flesh, and Bob has to recharge before they can use it again, making Banjo and Kazooie's quest a bit more urgent. They stop by Bottle's house, telling his wife and kids that he's just fine and will be home soon. Then it's on to Isle o' Hags, which is this game's hub world. It's much larger than Grunty's lair, with a bit more variety in its locations. Grunty's lair probably had a bit more personality to it, and it fit Banjo Kazooie perfectly, but Isle o' Hags fits Tooie perfectly, and I honestly prefer it. It feels genuinely huge and explorable, and it makes the worlds feel more like real places. I just think it's cool to imagine this big world was just outside Spiral Mountain all along. Our next stop is Jiggy Wiggy's Temple. Instead of having to hunt down different puzzles hidden throughout the game to unlock levels, you'll bring your Jiggies here every time you want to unlock a new world. This takes some of the fun out of unlocking levels, but it is convenient. Anytime you have enough Jiggies, you can just warp back to old Jiggy Wig's Temple, which also just looks pretty cool. Speaking of warping, it's much improved in this game. In Grunty's lair, you could warp using these cauldrons, but each was connected to a specific location, making it kind of clumsy to use. In Isle o' Hags, you can warp from one of these silos to any other silo in the game, making it much easier and quicker to get where you're going. But now it's time to talk about gameplay. What's changed? Well, the core mechanics remain almost untouched, which means you can jump right into Tooie and feel like you know what you're doing. You still have access to all the moves Bottles taught you, so controlling Banjo Kazooie will feel familiar. But make no mistake, Tooie is a much different game, and it makes some big changes in other areas. It's still a collectathon, meaning the object of the game is to collect various items. Some of these you'll recognize. Jiggies are still the primary collectible, used to unlock worlds as you go through the game. Notes are back, but they've been completely reworked. In Kazooie, they were required to open doors to progress through Grunty's lair. In Banjo Tooie, notes are what you use to unlock new moves. Since Bottles is, burnt to a crisp and dead, his military brother Jam Jars teaches you these moves in his stead. I like Jam Jars, and he has some funny moments, but I'm more fond of Bottles, and his presence is missed. Many of these moves, like grabbing onto ledges or actually aiming your eggs, feel so natural that it's honestly kind of a bummer going back to Kazooie without them. Still, a lot of the moves you learn are admittedly pretty contextual, much like the first game's moves. I think Tooie does a better job of keeping the mechanics you learn relevant though, even the ones from Kazooie, making it a more rounded gameplay experience. Progression through ILO hags will rely on the moves you learn, which makes progression feel more natural while still being tied to notes. Jinjos also make a reappearance, but instead of just having to find 5 in one visit for a Jiggy on each level, they are scattered all throughout the game world. Reuniting a family of similarly colored Jinjos will earn you a Jiggy, and it's always rewarding to see them back in their homes. Honeycomb pieces are still required to increase your health, with each upgrade costing more and more instead of the static 6-piece requirement from Kazooie. The last collectible is the Cheeto Scrolls, which you can return to Cheeto in Grunty's lair for some cheat codes. Overall, I think the collectible system works a bit better in Tooie. It's been expanded, but it's also more streamlined, and there's a really satisfying sense of progression as you find more and more Jinjos and Scrolls and Honeycombs. Banjo Tooie does a great job of holding on to what made Banjo Kazooie fun, while evolving and expanding at the same time. But to see where this game really steps up, we have to look at its worlds. Mayahem Temple is up first, and it perfectly establishes the high standard Tooie sets for itself. It's actually similar in theme to Mumbo's Mountain, the first level from Kazooie. They both adopt a tribal aesthetic, but where Mumbo's Mountain was a bit vague and flat, Mayahem Temple is deep and immersive. It's buried in the heart of a lush jungle, with huge structures reminiscent of ancient Central and South America, complete with pyramids, towers, and even an arena. The music is excellent, which you'll find is par for the course for Tooie. The boss, Targitson, is a towering and glorious totem god. This is just the first level in the game, and it's already a huge step up from Kazooie in terms of theme. All of the levels follow suit. Banjo Kazooie had Treasure Trove Cove, which was a loosely pirate-themed beach. Banjo Tooie has Jolly Roger Lagoon, which includes a charming little pirate town and a vast underwater city to explore. Banjo Kazooie had Mad Monster Mansion, which was literally the most basic Halloween level you could imagine. Tooie has Witchy World, a genuinely creepy and hilariously trashy amusement park. Kazooie had Freezy Peak, a standard Christmas level. Tooie has Hellfire Peaks, a world split between a frozen snowy mountain and a fiery volcano. Don't misunderstand me. I still love Kazooie's colorful cartoony style. I just think the more realized and thematic worlds of Tooie are superior. But style and theme aren't the only things to talk about. Perhaps more importantly, what is the gameplay like? Tooie pivots from the more compact playground-esque design of Kazooie's levels. There's less of an emphasis on platforming, with more focus being given to exploration, which Tooie's levels are perfectly suited for. Every world has lots of different areas to visit and rooms to check out, each providing their own challenges. Mumbo returns, and unlike Banjo Kazooie, he is present on every single level in the game. But he doesn't perform transformations like he did in the last game. That job has fallen to Humba Wumba, and honestly, she outclasses Mumbo in every regard. In my last video, I talked about how Mumbo's transformations were a bit basic, and ended up being more of an annoyance than anything. While this mechanic continues to be something of a chore, the transformations themselves are a massive improvement in Tooie. In Mayahem Temple, Humba turns you into a Stony, which is a little statuette of Banjo. This allows you to compete in the kickball tournament. If you approach the guard as Banjo and Kazooie, he tells you that only Stonies are allowed to compete. Once you're a Stony, he sees right through the disguise and calls you out on it, but he still lets you play since technically you meet the requirements. I just think that's funny and wanted to mention it. We'll talk more about the different transformations as we go, but for now let's get back to Mumbo. If he isn't performing transformations, then what is he doing? Well, in this game, you can actually play as Mumbo. This is really cool, and I loved it when I was a kid. But I have to say, going back to it now, it has lost a bit of its luster. Mumbo's moveset is almost as limited as his transformations of yore. He can run, jump, swim, and zap people with his zap stick. Okay, that last part is actually pretty fun, but his primary purpose is to use these Mumbo pads to alter the level in some way to allow Banjo and Kazooie to complete objectives. In Mayahem Temple, he animates a giant statue and uses it to break open these massive doors. This is cool stuff, but it's still ultimately just an unnecessary extra step, making Mumbo something of a middleman. This on its own would not be so bad. I mean, it doesn't usually take that long to warp to Mumbo's Skull, swap out, warp to the pad, pull off a quick Beacon Bokum, then warp back and change back to Baron Bird. The real issue is that Mumbo isn't the only such mechanic. We already talked about the transformations, so that makes 3 gameplay states you'll change between. But later on, the game introduces a pad that will split Banjo and Kazooie up and allow you to play as them individually. Again, really cool concept, but combined with the others, that means you'll essentially be switching between 5 separate characters. Now, usually this isn't as bad as it may sound. All of Banjo Tooie's worlds have warp pads in key locations, making it much more manageable to travel, especially in later levels, which can be quite large and segmented. And I appreciate a lot of the way these mechanics are applied. They are often used to open up areas for Banjo and Kazooie to explore later. As an example, let's look at Glitter Gulch Mine, the level following Mayahem Temple. This world is one big mine with caves and tunnels and mountains of jewels. This was my favorite level as a kid, and it still stands out. The theme is lively, the atmosphere is inviting and charming, and I love the hokey music and these gremlin cowboys that pop up out of the ground. Humba transforms you into a dynamite trigger here, which you can use to blow up these rocks and piles of rubble. This gives you access to more of the level, which you can come back to as Banjo and Kazooie to explore. You can even open up a passageway between this level and the next, Witchy World, which brings me to another thing I love about Banjo Tooie's worlds: their interconnectivity. There are lots of secret pathways between all these worlds, and the game uses them in some really creative ways. The one between Glitter Gulch Mine and Witchy World is used to transport this box, which contains a UFO that you can ride in a minigame, and speaking of minigames, there are quite a few of them in Banjo Tooie. This is a criticism that often comes up when people talk about Banjo Tooie, but it's one that I've never really agreed with. Much like the boss battles, they add some variety to the gameplay. Some of them introduce completely new mechanics, while others require you to utilize moves you're already familiar with. As with anything, it's a matter of preference, but I've always liked the minigames. In my case, this is due in no small part to the fact that you can play all of these minigames in a multiplayer mode. I have 5 siblings, so when games had a couch multiplayer mode, it was always a plus. And even if minigames aren't your thing, they really aren't that intrusive. There are only a dozen or so jiggies that come from minigames, with the rest being tied to collectibles, bosses, or other challenges. Several of those minigame jiggies are located in Witchy World. This perfectly fits Witchy World's theme, which is a carnival, and incidentally one of the best worlds in the series. This level just perfectly captures everything that makes Banjo Tooie such a great game. The theme of a crusty, deadly theme park is really strong, but it's also segmented into little areas with their own amusement park themes, including a western zone, a space zone, and a haunted zone. Mr. Patch is an incredible boss with a really cool sense of scale and an awesome theme song. I think the minigames are a lot of fun and give it a real carnival feeling, and there's just a ton of personality all around. You can visit the mysterious Madame Grunty's tent, where she will tell, or more accurately, arbitrarily decide, your fortune. You can get refills on eggs and feathers here, but more often than not, all you win is a beating, which is naturally her favorite. If you visit her enough times, she'll actually give you a cheat code that lets you read these signs in Jiggy Wiggy's temple, which is a pretty neat secret. Humba's transformation here is an armored car, which is completely invincible and heavy as allowing you to ruthlessly barrel through enemies, which is as fun as it sounds. Witchy World is also where you'll most likely encounter your first Minjo, which are evil imposter Jinjos. They look identical to their cute counterparts, and will lure you closer by mimicking the cries of Jinjos before attacking. I'm not kidding when I say that, to this day, I have never been jump scared as badly as the first time I was attacked by one of these as a child. It was a traumatic event that fundamentally altered the way I look at the world. If Jinjos aren't sacred, nothing is. Overall, Witchy World is one of, if not the best Banjo world, but it still isn't quite my favorite. Jolly Roger's Lagoon follows Witchy World, and this one is my absolute favorite. At first it appears to be little more than a small little pirate town. There are several shops and a tavern to visit, and it's all very charming. But Jolly Roger's Lagoon is much larger than it seems. If you swim down into the lagoon, you discover a vast underwater world. There are large caverns full of aquatic life, there's a sunken ship, and of course, there's the sunken city of Atlantis, which is one of the coolest locations in the game. There's just so much to explore here, and having nearly an entire level take place underwater really mixes things up. And if you're worried about the annoyances that inevitably accompany underwater levels, such as air management and slow, awkward movement, well, think again. You can oxygenate the ocean with Mumbo, meaning you're free to explore at your own leisurely pace without worrying about drowning. And if a leisurely pace is not your thing, don't worry. If you revisit Spiral Mountain after learning the drill move in Glitter Gulch Mine, you can save Banjo's goldfish from underneath a boulder. As thanks, he will teach you how to swim faster, which makes navigating the undersea passages a breeze. Jolly Roger's Lagoon is just a masterfully designed level, from the atmosphere and visuals to the gameplay and exploration. You get to turn into a submarine here, which is awesome, but unfortunately not used for much. The boss is honestly not very fun, but the song is amazing, and Lord Wu Fak Fak is the greatest name I have ever heard. This is also the perfect level to demonstrate how creatively Banjo Tooie links its levels together. You can find these little pigs whining about the polluted water they've been swimming in. One has even grown an extra arm. In order to fix this problem, you have to stop the waste being dumped into the water. This waste actually comes from a later level in the game, Grunty Industries, which both ties into the narrative of Grunty being a rotten person, and it also adds some dynamism between these two levels. But it doesn't stop there. The pigs aren't satisfied with clean water. Apparently it's also freezing cold, so you have to dump some hot water in it from yet another later level, Hellfire Peaks. I just think this is really cool level design, and it makes collecting Jiggies a fun and diverse experience. Unfortunately, not all the worlds are as good as Witchy World and Jolly Roger's Lagoon, which brings us to Teractal Land. But first, we have to deal with Clunko again, who's looking a little rough after his beating. His gimmick is that he uses a different potion each time you fight him. In the first fight, he made himself grow into a giant, and in this one he turns invisible. It's still very easy, and he runs off begging for more beatings. Clunko, look, I get it, but this lifestyle isn't sustainable, okay? You need to get some help.
Why are you f***ing here, man? You're so old. Where's your wife? Go home to your family, dude.
Anyway, on to Teractal Land. This is, without exaggeration, the worst world in either game. On the surface, it doesn't seem so bad. It's a land of dinosaurs and cavemen, which is perfectly fine, if a bit cliché. This level actually has some pretty cool exploration, with rivers and caves to check out and a mountain to scale. It has the potential to be another great level like all the ones leading up to it, so where does it go wrong? Well, much like Rusty Bucket Bay and Click Clock Wood and Banjo Kazooie, it's not really that the level itself is bad, it's just that this is where the flaws in the game design overall really come to a head. Earlier I talked about how having to switch from Mumbo to Humbo to... Earlier I talked about how having to switch from Mumbo to Humba to Banjo to Kazooie makes the game needlessly segmented and cumbersome. Teractal Land takes that to a frankly ridiculous extent. There are two Humba transformations here, a baby T-Rex and a daddy T-Rex. Double the transformations, double the chore. That's already bad enough, but it gets much, much worse. Choosing which T-Rex isn't a simple matter of returning to Humba, or even traveling to a different Humba. No, choosing between these two transformations is facilitated by Mumbo, who uses this pad to shrink or enlarge Humba's tent. Are you starting to see the problem? Alright, I'll give you an example. Let's say you're playing as Banjo and Kazooie and you run into this caveman who refuses to let you pass. An idea strikes you. What if I come back as a dinosaur and scare him away? You run over to Humba's wigwam, transform, and run back. You try to frighten him, but he isn't impressed by your cute little roar. You need Daddy T-Rex, so you run all the way back to Humba and transform back to Banjo. Then you have to walk over to Mumbo's skull, swap out with him, run back to Humba's wigwam, do the beacon bokum, go back to the skull, get Banjo, go back to Humba, change to Daddy T-Rex, return to the caveman, make him his pants, go back to Humba again, turn to Banjo, go back to the cave, and finally you've made some progress. Warp pads help a little bit, but the process is still a downright insulting headache, especially on the 64 version where warping often comes with a loading time. And this isn't even accounting for the several sections that require Banjo and Kazooie to split up, or the train station. Oh right, the train station. I just praised Banjo Tooie for how its worlds are interconnected, but the train might be taking that element a bit too far. After beating Old King Cole in Glitter Gulch Mine, he lets you use his train to travel between different worlds, providing you've opened the station on the target level. This is used in some unique and interesting ways. When you first arrive at Grunty Industries, the place is locked down. To get inside, you have to open the train station, then ride the train here from another level, which allows you to open the door from the inside. In Hellfire Peaks, the icy side is too cold, so you first have to cool the engine off on the lava side, with a little help from our good friend Gobi, then travel to the icy side for a jiggy. Unfortunately though, the train joins the like of Mumbo and Humba as a mechanic that is independently really cool, but ends up just being another step in an endless string of chores. To demonstrate this, well, let's go back to Teractal Land. In one of the many caves, you find a family of dinosaurs, each of them with their own problems you have to solve. One of them is too small, which requires the use of a Mumbo pad, so have fun trekking all the way over to Mumbo and back for that one. But believe it or not, this one is the quickest, most convenient one. One of the others is sick. To heal her, you have to split Banjo and Kazooie, put her in Banjo's backpack, carry her to the train station. Oh, wait, the train isn't here. Time to go pick up Kazooie, head to whatever station the train is currently at, ride it back over to Teractal Land, then go pick up the sick dino. Make sure you don't let her out until you're inside the box cart, or you'll have to go get her again. Once she's in the cart, it's time to travel to the cliffside train station, where you swap out for Mumbo, heal the dino, switch back to Banjo and Kazooie, and then ride the train back to Teractal Land. For the third and final dino, you have to ride the train to Witchy World, assuming you've unlocked the train station there, save her from a cage, then cart her all the way back to Teractal Land. And this is all for, wait for it, one jiggy. Teractal Land is the perfect example of how Banjo Tooie's otherwise creative and fun systems interact with each other to create some really slow, grating gameplay, which is a legitimate criticism a lot of people have with the game. And for the record, Terry is a super lame boss, worst in the game for sure. I have a secret conspiracy theory that when people call Banjo Tooie bad, they're just remembering Teractal Land. But I've been rambling about dinosaurs for long enough, so let's move on to Grunty Industries. It's a towering factory spewing pollution and presumably subpar and overpriced products. To be fair though, I'd put some serious cash down for a pair of big O pants. Grunty Industries is split into 5 floors, which you might think would be annoying to navigate, but Grunty Industries ends up being a really dynamic level with a lot of fun exploration, making it one of my favorites. Like I mentioned, even getting inside the building is a creative and subversive challenge. There are different paths and methods you can take to get to each floor, and although the switching between characters is still a bit of a chore, I actually enjoyed the way it's implemented here. Figuring out how to get places with different movesets is a fun challenge, and it rewards your knowledge of the level. Humba transforms you into a washing machine that can shoot underwear, which is a ton of fun on its own, but you can also use these service elevators to access different areas of the level. Fun fact, in Banjo Kazooie, there's a very small chance that Mumbo will accidentally turn you into a washing machine before changing you back, so it's fun to see it return as a fully fledged transformation. Overall, Grunty Industries is a solid level. I love the idea that Grunty is just running this evil corporation on the side, and it adds a lot of personality to her and the game. Weldar is a fun and actually pretty hard boss fight, and of course the music is incredible. I talked about how much I loved Grant Kirkhope's work in the last video, but I don't want to gloss over just how genius his music is, not just in its composition, but also in its implementation. Every level's theme is unique, memorable, and absolutely jammable, and the tracks are impressively dynamic and fluid, even more than they were in Banjo Kazooie. The music shifts as you move through the levels, changing with every area, sub-area, minigame, and boss fight. It makes the game feel incredible to play, and the worlds, which are already immensely explorable, become even more immersive and diverse. I listen to Banjo Tooie music regularly, which is not something I can really say for Banjo Kazooie, even though I do love the music from that game too. I'm no music theorist, but just as an enjoyer of music, Grant Kirkhope really outdid himself for this game, and it's a truly masterful soundtrack. Hellfire Peaks follows Grunty Industries, and it's another banger. If not for Jolly Roger Lagoon, this one might be my favorite. It's a land of extremes, split into 2 deadly mountains. One is a fiery volcano spewing lava, and the other is a frigid snowscape. It's one of the most deadly zones Banjo Tooie has to offer, between the lava, freezing water, yetis, and fiery demon hands. Navigating between the 2 polarized mountains makes for some great exploration, and lends itself to some unique and creative challenges. Humba Wumba turns Banjo into a snowball on this level, and his size changes depending on how much health he has. Rolling through snow will cause him to grow and regenerate health, while the heat of the lava side will cause him to slowly melt. This is really cool, and I wish more of the transformations were integrated directly into the mechanics of the world itself like this. Mumbo's task is to resurrect several dead characters. This is just as menial as the rest of Mumbo's functions, but bringing the dead to life is fun, so I'll give it a pass. Hellfire Peaks actually has two bosses, though they are nearly identical. Chili Billy and Chili Willy are a pair of hungry dragon brothers, and you have to use ice and fire eggs against them respectively. Like most bosses, they aren't that hard, but they give the world a nice climactic set piece. Hellfire Peaks is a fantastic level, lending itself to Banjo Tooie's strong endgame and exemplifying everything the game does well. The last proper world in Banjo Tooie is Kakul Land, a bizarre collection of islands set high in the sky. It goes out of its way to be strange and nonsensical, and I think it works really well. After all the strong, identifiable themes of previous levels, having a completely wacky and abstract level to top things off is a surprising and refreshing change of pace. This also allows for a collection of unique and diverse challenges and settings that wouldn't fit anywhere else, including a wasp nest, a germ-infested trash can, a towering pot of gold, and of course a giant wedge of stinky cheese. Unfortunately, playing the level isn't quite as fun as the theme itself. It's segmented in a way that makes navigating it kind of a chore, and not in an interesting way like Grunty Industries. Having to switch between characters obviously makes that worse, but it's nowhere near as bad as Teractal Land. Kakul Land's boss is really cool though. Upon entering the level, you might notice that there are two Mumbo skulls. One is just regular old Mumbo, but when you go to the other one, he attacks you suddenly and reveals that he is not in fact Mumbo, but a cybotic doppelganger named Minji Jongo. He's actually pretty tough, spamming spells as he teleports around the room. As you damage him, his disguise wears off, revealing the robotic frame underneath. He's one of my favorite bosses, and not just because he makes a Star Trek reference. Humbo's transformation here is actually just an improvement on one of Mumbo's old ones from Banjo Kazooie, a bee. In Kazooie, the bee was so superficial and underutilized that I didn't even mention it in that video. It was limited to the spring section only of Click Clock Wood, and all it could do was run, jump, and fly. In Tooie, it's a bit more fleshed out. It has gained the ability to boost and shoot stingers from its nose? Do bees have noses? Okay, from the pointy thing on its face. Even so, the bee doesn't have much utility, and even its ability to fly is redundant since this level has flight pads anyway. Overall, Kakul Land is a fine level. Not quite as good as a few of its predecessors, but also not quite as bad as some of them. After this level comes Banjo Tooie's final act, but first I want to talk about the game overall and address some of the common criticisms it receives. Despite being similar to Banjo Kazooie in terms of mechanics and core gameplay, Banjo Tooie is a much different game. For some people, like me, that's a good thing, but many people see Banjo Tooie as completely inferior to the original. Now, everyone gets to have their own opinions for their own reasons, and I'm not interested in telling anyone they're wrong or mounting some spirited defense of Banjo Tooie. If you think this game isn't as good, that's completely valid. But there are a couple of common points that people make when criticizing Banjo Tooie, and I just wanted to touch on them and explain why, to me, they aren't actually criticisms. The first one, probably the biggest one, is backtracking. Every time I talk to someone who doesn't like this game, this comes up, and that's fair. If you don't like backtracking, you don't like backtracking. But if you say that, I'm also going to assume that you don't like Metroid Prime, Hollow Knight, Castlevania Symphony of the Night, Animal Well. These are all games that are universally agreed upon to be good or even great games, and they all heavily feature backtracking. You wouldn't criticize them for that because it's baked into the formula itself, that being the Metroidvania formula. Banjo Tooie isn't a Metroidvania in the traditional sense, but the same principle applies. The backtracking is clearly intended, and the game is designed around that. As you grow your suite of abilities, the number of collectibles that are accessible to you increases. And outside of a few examples, the backtracking is extremely non-intrusive, much less so than a traditional Metroidvania. As I played through this game, I went from level to level, just collecting as much as I could. If I got stumped or felt that I didn't have the tools to progress further, I just moved on to the next world. Then, after I had gone through all of them and learned all the moves, I went all the way back to Mayahem Temple and started collecting the things that I couldn't before. This is not only extremely reasonable as far as backtracking goes, but it was also incredibly satisfying to go back to these worlds and complete them. I think the backtracking is one of Banjo Tooie's strengths, not one of its weaknesses. But even if you're super hyper allergic to backtracking, the most you'll be required to do it is once or maybe twice in a few instances. I've also heard people call Banjo Tooie's worlds too big, and honestly I just think that's a little narrow-minded. If you prefer the more compact level design of Banjo Kazooie, that's perfectly valid and I can't blame you, but I just think that there's no denying that the vastness of Tooie's worlds is one of the things that makes it great. They're so explorable and immersive, and their size just makes their intricacy all the more impressive. Outside of one particularly prehistoric exception, I would say that Banjo Tooie has some of the best level design I've ever seen in a 3D platformer. This is less common, but sometimes people will also criticize the game's darker tone, comparing it to the whimsical, cartoony vibe of its predecessor. I'm personally very glad they didn't just go for more of the same. The deeper, darker tone makes it distinct from Kazooie, allowing for some more diverse level themes and providing some really great humor and subversive moments. In Hellfire Peaks, you meet this ice cube named Mildred. She's sitting on a Jinjo and tells you that you can have him if you find her husband George, who was swept away in a blizzard. You can find George in Kakul Land, and he asks you to give him a nudge over the edge so he can fall back down to Hellfire Peaks. Unfortunately, when you do so, he lands on the wrong side and immediately melts away. Going back to Mildred, she remains unaware of her husband's fate and refuses to give you the Jinjo. So, how do you get it then? This is not just funny and surprising, but it provides a fun and subversive puzzle, putting a twist on the traditional video game quest that would be right at home in Banjo Kazooie. I already touched on the minigames thing, so I'll just say that I think the minigames fit perfectly into the formula, and they add some variety and spice to the gameplay. My overall point here is just that these are all matters of opinion, and which take you'll prefer comes down to your own tastes. That doesn't make the decisions of either game inherently inferior, though I think both do some things better or worse than the other. But I don't want to get bogged down in comparisons. Banjo Tooie is a great game that deserves to stand on its own legs, and like all of my videos, I'm just talking about why I love it so much, not why you're wrong if you don't. So let's just agree that Banjo Kazooie and Banjo Tooie are both fantastic games, and move on to the final level. Cauldron Keep is Gruntilda's hideout, and serves as a series of final encounters rather than a full-on world. It consists of an imposing tower surrounded by acid, and once you breach it, you do battle against Klungo one last time. He's looking worse than ever, and when you beat him this time, he's finally had enough. He's worried that the continued beatings are making him less handsome, and that Mrs. Klungo won't love him anymore. I think she's probably more upset about the serial adultery, but okay. With him out of the way, it's time to face Grunty once again in a deadly game of trivia. This is the Tower of Tragedy quiz, and similarly to Grunty's Furnace Fun from Banjo Kazooie, it tests your knowledge of the game. It's a bit more straightforward, and has you competing against Grunty's sisters as you buzz in and answer questions, with a 1-ton weight hanging ominously over your head. I like this segment a lot. It's a bit of fun and levity before the final showdown. It's also funny to me that Grunty could just smash you with the weight, but for whatever reason she follows the rules of the game, escaping on her rocket podium when you win. This allows Banjo and Kazooie to progress to the Bob, which they use to bring Bottles and King Jingling back to life. All the characters congregate at Bottles' house to celebrate, but alas, Banjo and Kazooie are not invited, as they still have to take down the witch once and for all. If you go visit Bottles' house during this section, he just tells you can't come in until you beat the witch. Ungrateful bastard, we literally just brought you back from the dead. The final boss is actually blocked by another Jiggy Gate, and this might actually contribute to why people think the backtracking is so bad. It only takes 55 Jiggies to get into Cauldron Keep, but you need another 15 to face Grunty. If you were geared up to fight the final boss and beat the game, only to discover that you have to go back and collect more Jiggies, I can understand why that might leave a sour taste in your mouth. I don't have an issue with it, and in any case, I already had all 90 Jiggies when I got here, so it didn't matter for this playthrough. The final boss sees Grunty piloting the Hag 1, which is the same drill machine that attacked Spiral Mountain. It's a great finale, leaning into the personality established for Grunty over the course of the game. She uses all the wicked machinery at her disposal to take you down, occasionally popping out to ask trivia questions and cast spells. It lacks the whimsy and cartoony fun of Banjo Kazooie's final battle, but I still like it. Grunty has a lot of funny dialogue here, and I just love her personality in this game. This battle is a lot more intense than the last fight against her, and it's actually quite difficult. Towards the end, she floods the arena with gas, effectively putting you on a time limit, and then she ends the fight by hurling an endless barrage of deadly spells at you. To beat her, you have to hit her with an egg while she's preparing one of those spells. As a result, she drops the spell in her lap, which destroys the Hagwon and puts an end to her schemes. This is a unique and funny way to end the boss fight, and it speaks to the creativity and humor of the team behind this game. But now that the witch is properly defeated, Banjo and Kazooie hurry to Bottle's house to join the party, along with Mumbo and Humba. By the time they get there, Klungo has eaten all of the food and the party is over, which is, as Humba so astutely puts it, big heap bummer. So the four of them go to the top of Grunty's tower for a game of kick around. God, that's the most British thing I've ever heard. And they even let Grunty in on the fun. Oh, she's loving it. And on that note, Banjo Tooie ends. Banjo Tooie is an amazing game, and I've fallen in love with it all over again. I'm more aware of its flaws now, but I also appreciate its achievements even more. The gorgeous and immersive worlds, the bingeable and memorable soundtrack, the varied and engaging gameplay, the irreverent, quirky tone, deep atmospheres, striking characters, and much, much more all come together to provide a truly unique and enjoyable gaming experience. I would really love to see this game get the credit it deserves. It's an excellent sequel that arguably surpasses its predecessor, but even if you don't buy that, you have to admit that Tooie offers a unique and memorable experience. There's so much to this game, and there are several things I didn't cover. Banjo Tooie has some fun secrets that I don't want to give away. If you've never played this game, if you've ever dismissed it based on what someone else said, I urge you to dive in and give it a chance. I bet it will surprise you. Thank you all so much for watching. I really enjoyed talking about this game and making this video, and I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. This video took quite a bit longer to make than I thought it would, and I worked really hard, so if you liked it, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. It would mean more than you know. I'm planning on making a fun video where I rank the levels from Kazooie and Tooie, and I would love to see you there. Check out my Kazooie video if you haven't, or take a look at the other videos on my channel. But until next time, see you later and take care.